Usually, the summer months are deadly quiet at the Vatican. Not this year. One high-ranking cardinal is defending himself against sex abuse allegations. Another, who questioned the Pope's teaching on Amoris Laetitia, has died. And the second highest-ranking Vatican official has been sacked and replaced. For explanation and analysis, we are joined by the one and only Papal Posse. With me in studio is editor-in-chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Arroyo, and via satellite from Manhattan, Father Jerry Murray, canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York. Thank you both for being with me. I wasn't going to have you back so soon, but events keep compelling the posse to gather together. I want to start with Cardinal Pell. Cardinal Pell, who was the head of the financial secretariat, who streamlined so much of the financial apparatus at the Vatican, suddenly again at the center of global headlines due to sex abuse allegations. Robert Royal, what is happening here? And then we'll play a bite from Cardinal Pell.
Well, it would be good if we knew exactly what was happening, because these allegations have been bubbling beneath the surface for years.
But he already answered this. He sat for
He's been through this. What the troubling thing here is we don't know whether we're dealing with an accusation against him or whether this is he didn't handle very well some abusive priest. Now, what we do know historically is that when he was moved into Melbourne, he immediately set up a commission. This is back in 1976, something like that, before the crisis broke elsewhere. But it's very worrisome that Cardinal Pell, who's a very substantial, important figure at the Vatican, now has got to deal with this when there's so much else that needs to be done in Rome.
I want to play this. This is Cardinal George Pell reacting to these sex abuse allegations in his native Australia, and then Father Gerhard Muller will respond. Watch.
There have been leaks to the media. There's been relentless character assassination. A relentless character assassination. I'm looking forward, finally, to having my day in court. I'm innocent of these charges. They are false. The whole idea of sexual abuse is abhorrent to me.
Father Jerry, when you hear that, and we've watched Cardinal George Pell respond to this over the years, he has cleared his name on a number of other occasions where he was falsely accused. These two people coming forward, the ones we know so far, are ex-cons. I mean, these are not exactly the most credible, sterling characters making these accusations. Your response?
Well, I agree with the Cardinal. I'm glad he's getting his day in court. I regret that the justice system in Australia would see fit to indict a man and then not reveal the charges instantaneously. We have to wait till, I believe it's July 26th before we know the specifics. So undoubtedly the Cardinal and his lawyer have been informed, but not the rest of us. So yeah, let's see what the charges are, because for me to put a man through this limbo of saying, we're going to accuse you of crimes and we're not going to tell you until 3 weeks later, that's unfair. But the Cardinal asking or saying that he will respond, going back to Australia as he's done, his innocence he protests very strongly, and I'm glad he's going to be able to have his day in court, and I hope and pray he gets vindicated, because I admire this man. This man has done such good for the life of the Church, and if this really is a question of governmental harassment against him, well, then that has to be exposed completely.
There was some concern I read online, and again, you don't know how much veracity there is in these accounts. Some are saying that the consistent drumbeat of this is meant to undermine the character of Cardinal Pell, because they're hoping it will also undermine his financial reforms, which some in Rome are not too pleased with. Any credibility there? Do you think there might be some veracity to that?
Well, I keep hearing this, and I hear that there are anti-Catholic elements in Australia who have brought this stuff up again, you know, when we thought it was settled. But it's hard to say. It's in one way he has been sidelined, as you know. There were steps he was trying to take to have external auditors look into things, and then that was stopped, and they said they would conduct internal audits. So there's some turmoil there that involves maybe some internal desire to rein him in, and then there's something back home. There's something else going on back home that they're trying to get at him at a key moment.
Yeah, I want to talk about this other scandal, really, that we read about in the last few days. Cardinal Coco Palmerio, who wrote that book most recently, defending the Pope's teaching on Amoris Laetitia, He has a secretary in his congregation that interprets legislative texts, Monsignor Luigi Posse. Now, apparently he occupies Cardinal Ratzinger's old apartment, and there was a bust into that apartment where they found this Monsignor Posse and several of his friends engaged in what was described in the papers as an orgy, and a drug-fueled one. What does this tell us about the culture we're seeing in Rome? Some are saying, look, this is evidence the Pope hasn't done enough, and that these sorts of things are exploding during his reign. Father Gerald Murray, you'd say what?
Well, I'd say it brings shame on the Holy See. Not that everyone's guilty, of course, of crimes or drug use, but when an influential priest like this is seized by the Vatican police and brought to a drug rehab hospital in order to be detoxified, I'm told that the priest is now at a monastery. I've read that, and that's good. I mean, he has definitely a need to spend time in prayer and repentance. But the real question, I guess, that lies behind it is, how is anything like this even possible? Is there any kind of level of, we would say, following or review of professional qualification and behavior among those who work in the Holy See, apart from simply that you're in an office and you work for somebody and that somebody looks after you? I mean, to think that this man would be importing drugs into a Vatican apartment building, you know, people can sneak anything in, I suppose. Yeah. But this needs, if I was in charge over there of reviewing things, I'd say we need to have some more procedures for how we look at the behavior of people who are representing important positions in the church.
Right. Well, you have the drugs. I mean, you have the drugs, and then you have the, you know, what's described in the papers as the young boys coming up the staircases. And then I read Cardinal Pomereo advocated on this man's behalf, hoping that he would be made a bishop. I mean, this is where you kind of, you do scratch your head and wonder what's happening there.
Well, you know, in the context of that famous "who am I to judge" remark that the Pope made very early on in his pontificate, he also suggested early on that although there were gay elements, of course, in the Vatican, he couldn't find a gay lobby, he said. And I think that it seems to me that it's obvious at this point because of the number of cases that have cropped up. And I have to say, from credible Vaticanists in Rome, people I trust who I've known over the years, they think it's a very widespread network. So if Francis really wanted to dig into this, he could. And it looks like it's getting to the time when something needs to be done, because it's just outrageous at this point in history that it goes on in Rome.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a scandal to the faithful at the end of the day. I mean, look, humanity is humanity. People do bad things no matter whether they wear a collar or not. But when you're seeing cases like this multiply in one place and right under the nose of the Pope, it looks really bad.
We're not talking about somebody who had an individual sexual relationship. Right. This was apparently happened so often, and the police were called repeatedly, and then finally there was this big bust.
Unbelievable. I want to talk about Cardinal Mueller, Gerhard Muller, who was on our show just a few weeks ago. And ironically now, he was talking about the termination. I mean, you were talking about the Pope getting involved in things. In December, the Pope terminated 3 priests at the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. Now, at the time, the thought was that these priests were sidelined because they were critical of the Pope's teaching. Here is a little bit of my exchange with Cardinal Mueller, and then we'll talk about what happened to him in the past week. Watch.
I am in favor of a better treatment of our officials in the Holy See, because we cannot only speak about the social doctrine, and we must also respect it. And the Pope himself said, we are some old behaviors of the courts, and I am absolutely against these treatments. And I say we can dismiss only people if they make a mistake. And the criteria for our collaborators in our congregation must be the orthodoxy and the integrity of moral and priestly life.
Now we know Cardinal Mueller has been terminated himself as head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. Father Gerald Murray, your reaction to this, was this motivated, do you think, by the same impetus that caused the dismissal of those 3 employees that the Cardinal referenced?
Well, I think we can say fairly, if the Pope were happy with Cardinal Muller, he would not have released him from his job after his 5-year term was ended. And according to Cardinal Muller, the Pope has told him that this non-renewal of his term is in line with a new policy in which, in general, the Pope will only allow curialists, meaning people who work in the Curia, to last for 5 years, one term. If that is the case, if that's what's going on here, then we have a serious discussion that needs to go on. What is the magic of a 5-year term? People who are qualified and working in offices should be allowed to continue if they're serving the good of the Church. So I think there may be more than simply the end of a term going on. Now, I have to say, as I've said before on your show, the Pope is sovereign. He can do what he wants. But not every decision is necessarily to be seen as the best management policy. And in the case of Cardinal Muller, I like the man very much. I respect what he's doing. And, the Pope has said a number of times he wants a vigorous debate. He doesn't want yes men. Well, this is a man who gave debate, and he was a loyal servant, but he was also not a doormat. So I hope the Pope doesn't go down this path with others because he would, I think, be depriving himself of good advice from trusted officials.
I want to put up this full screen. This is the Cardinal's reaction to a German source. He did an interview with a German newspaper. This is what Cardinal Gerhard Muller said of his termination or dismissal by the Pope, the non-renewal of his term. He said, quote, "He did not give a reason, just as he gave no reason for dismissing 3 highly competent members of the CDF a few months earlier. I cannot accept this way of doing things. As a bishop, one cannot treat people in this way." Your thoughts, Robert Arroyo?
Yeah, I think what comes through very clearly here is how personally he took the manner in which he was dismissed. I almost thought that maybe earlier he knew that this was coming, but apparently he didn't know this till the last 24 hours. And he keeps inserting this personal element into the kind of Catholic social justice mold, that you don't treat people this way. And that's the one thing that's, I think, very credible about this whole process. There have been a lot of rumors that I think are unfortunate about how he was dismissed and asked certain questions. I think those were probably not true. But here there's really an element that he feels this personally, but he knows also that this reflects something that's wrong in the way that the management of the Church is being conducted.
Well, you saw that, Father Jerry, in the interview we did with Cardinal Muller. He was practically tearing up. I don't know if you could see it on camera, but boy, I could see it one-on-one. The room went silent, and he got very moved and visibly upset when he talked about those 3 employees who were dismissed and the way in which they were dismissed.
And I sympathize with the Cardinal completely when his employees, meaning his collaborators, people, priests who worked in the Doctrine of the Faith with him, were told they have to clear out and leave their job. This was just at Christmas time, by the way, when this all came down.
Right.
This is something we have to reflect on. The Church is not a corporation. In corporate America, if the people in charge decide you're gone, pack up your desk, you're gone that day.
Right.
The Church is meant to be, this communion of faith and of love, and there has to be, accountability. But how can you have accountability if someone is simply told you're gone? And sometimes when we're looking at the situation in the Curia, we think back to the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and we say, intrigue and conspiracy, and it's much better these days. But there are a lot of shadows from the past now, it seems, cast over the Vatican.
There was something interesting here that I picked up. America Magazine mentioned in their reporting that a number of cardinals were urging the dismissal of Cardinal Muller. And they were doing so, going to the Pope and requesting it because they felt somehow he was undermining the Pope's teaching. Cardinal Muller had this to say, I'll put it on the full screen, about particular cardinals, and again, Amoris Laetitia keeps cropping up again and again and again. I know we sound like we're beating a dead horse, but this is the centrifuge around which so much of this is buzzing. Cardinal Muller says, "I must stress with all due clarity that the attempts up to now by Cardinal Schönborn, Casper, and others to explain how we can achieve a balancing act between dogma, that is church teaching, and pastoral practice are simply not convincing." Was it thoughts like that that got Cardinal Muller into trouble with maybe these cardinals and certainly some of the other close collaborators of the Pope?
No doubt it wouldn't be a surprise if that were the case. The thing that struck me about Cardinal Mueller all along in this process, though, is what a loyal soldier he actually was. He tried to defend the Holy Father, to be on his side, to say there was no conflict between the two of them, but at the same time, he would just affirm, as I think he did in the interview you did with him, that we always have to read documents in light of the tradition. We don't just make things up as we go along, and even if the Holy Spirit inspires something new, it's going to be in harmony with what went before. I don't know if the rumor is true that these big cardinals were coming to the Pope and advising him to get rid of Cardinal Mueller, but it is not implausible, let's say that.
Father Gerald Murray, we also had reports, in fact, Cardinal Mueller himself said he spoke to Cardinal Meissner, who was one of the dubia cardinals, one of those 4 cardinals questioning Pope Francis, just asking him to clarify the teaching on Amoris Laetitia and its implications. Cardinal Meissner is now dead, and Mueller spoke to him just a few days before his death. What does this portend for the dubia? And now Mueller is saying maybe I can be the connector between the 3 remaining dubia cardinals and the Pope. Your thoughts on all of that?
Well, you know, God rest the soul of Cardinal Meissner, an admirable servant of the Church. The dubia are not going to go away, and the reason is the dubia are questions. They're placed in the theological context of the doctrine of the faith. They are an attempt to take what Pope Francis has written in Amoris Laetitia and make it in complete conformity in all aspects with the Catholic tradition. Now that is a good way to deal with something that is obviously a disputing matter because, as we know, a number of hierarchies throughout the world are authorizing communion for people who are in adulterous second marriages. And while the Church has a mission and outreach to everyone, we don't give sacraments to people who defy Christ's words about the indissolubility of marriage. So if Cardinal Mueller can now turn around and word broker is not good, this isn't a political scene, but advance the discussion here and try to take the Pope at his own word. The Pope is the Pope of encounter. How many times have we heard that? The Pope wants to go out to the peripheries. Well, right now, someone who doesn't get an answer to a dubia for, over 250 days, they might feel like they're on a periphery. And, rightly so, because these questions are not simply academic matters. They have to do with the life and faith of the Church and all the dioceses throughout the world. I think the Pope would be well advised to sit down with the dubia cardinals, and if Cardinal Muller wants to be part of that, wonderful, and then resolve what is a doubt, or in this case, 5 doubts.
Your gut on this, Robert Royal, would Cardinal Muller at this point be a connector, interlocutor between the Pope and these cardinals?
I would find it hard to see that. I think that we'd need somebody else to come in with some fresh perspectives. He's just been in the trenches for so long and been in, if truth be told, in a very difficult circumstance between various forces inside the Vatican. I think that he ought to go on and continue to say the things that he said and not try to artificially insert it into the space between the Pope and the dubia cardinals.
We spoke a moment ago, Father Jerry, about granting communion to people who are in objective sin. You had a book review of a new book by Father James Martin, the famous Jesuit, which attempts to build a bridge between the Church and the LGBT community, a term you're not happy with. Tell me, first of all, why you're not happy with that term, and B, how Amoris Laetitia somehow ties in with the argument that Father Martin is advancing, or perhaps in your thinking, I think, shouldn't be.
Right, well, Father Martin's written a book which is basically an attempt to call the gay community into a dialogue with the Catholic Church, and then the Church to kind of approach them in a new way. And Father Martin uses the acronym LGBT. That's a political term. It covers a lot of different people. I think if we're dealing with people who have a problem with homosexuality, we ought to just speak about it in those simple terms. Now, my problem with Father Martin's book...
Father Martin, and I've heard him in interviews say, wait a minute, this is how this community defines themselves. You got pro-life people, they should be known as pro-life people. These people say they're LGBT, you should allow them to be self-identifying. Why is that not acceptable?
No, because words have meaning. Acronyms, why not say the whole acronym, use all the words so people know what you mean? How would a student who never heard this term understand it? Now, but the point is, people don't get to self-define themselves when they're part of a broader reality, because the self-identification may be misleading. There is no LGBT community out there in the sense of an identifiable group of people with common interests. What we have here is different groups of people who reject the Church's teaching about sexual morality. And when it comes to gay, gay is a political term. That is, was specifically designed to abstract us from the reality of what homosexuality is. Now, the book itself, I think, is seriously flawed, and precisely because Father Martin no longer wants the Church to call the homosexual attraction or inclination intrinsically disordered. He wants to call it differently ordered. But, God established the world in a certain way, male and female, He made them. And that's how the human race continues, and that's how man and woman are supposed to express love in marriage. So any other use of the sexual faculty outside of the marriage of a man and a woman is a disordered use of it. That's what the Pope, the Church is saying. The Pope Francis says the same thing, by the way. Father Martin's on an effort here, I think, to change Church teaching by getting us to change Church doctrine, language. And, doctrinal change is preceded by verbal change. So we got to stick to reality, words that reflect reality. That's how we get to understand what's at issue.
Robert Royal, you wanted to add what?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the problem here is, what is the bridge being used for? Because the main purpose of the Church in the world is to bridge the gap between man and God, to lead everyone to God. Now, obviously, we reach out to people in all sorts of different circumstances who are troubled, tempted, etc. But the ultimate movement has got to be toward what God has revealed to us through Jesus Christ. And instead, what we seem to be getting here is an attempt to kind of dilute and move out. And these sorts of bridge building, it seems to me, are intended to essentially legitimize positions that have never been legitimate in the Church prior to this.
Before I let you all go, we've got to get into the Pope's phoning habits again to Eugenio Scalfari. Now, this is a atheist, 90-year-old journalist in Italy, kind of an institution, but, a guy who doesn't record his interviews. He's gotten the Pope into trouble before by misquoting or quoting out of context things he said. Now, this has emerged. We'll put it up on the full screen. This is Pope Francis calling Scalfari before the G20 meeting. He said, "I'm afraid there are very dangerous alliances between powers who have a distorted view of the world. America and Russia, China and North Korea, Russia and Assad in the war in Syria." And he goes on to say the danger concerns immigration. Our main and unfortunately growing problem in the world today is that the poor, the weak, the excluded, which includes migrants. And then he says at one point that Europe must take on a federal structure. Robert Royal, what does that mean?
I was just in Portugal 2 weeks ago at a big conference with sort of center-right, very serious intellectual people. And the Germans there were talking more and more about ever closer relationships in the EU. And most of us who are not German, our ears kind of perked up when we heard this, because clearly what is going to happen if there's a federated structure in Europe is it's going to be largely Germany writ large. And whether that's a good or a bad thing, I don't know. It just seems to me that the Pope might be on the right track, that Europe will not play a very large role in the world because they're being passed by these other powers. But at the same time, what is this federated structure? It's not as if Europe itself, and the Pope himself doesn't seem to have a great deal of love for what Europe has been historically. He's looking elsewhere to the peripheries for inspiration in the Church. So, okay, he kind of recommended something that was intended to be a counterbalance to what's going on with the really big powers. But what it is, it seems to me, is a very vague notion. It's an ideal, and maybe something could come out of it. But the way Europe has existed up until now is not a very promising prospect.
Father Jerry Murray, your reaction to this, and did you see that piece, which it was an interview with a collaborator of Pope Benedict XVI, who wrote a number of books with him, helped co-author books with him about the West and Christianity in the West, and his take on what he sees here?
Well, specifically on immigration, which is largely the topic of the day in Europe, they've got a big problem. unchecked immigration of non-Christian people, in this case Muslim people, into Europe will over time change the demographics of those countries and will change, therefore, the laws, culture, and whole way of life of those countries. If you have a majority Muslim nation in Europe, they are going to cast off the laws that Christian civilization has brought to those nations. That's a serious problem, and I think the people who live in Europe don't want that, but their leaders seem to be kind of paralyzed. I mean, why is it that when boatloads of people are being brought into the Mediterranean, that they're not then turned back and sent back to where they came from, be it North Africa, the Middle East? Now, they say you've got to have humanitarian and all the rest, but largely these people have paid thousands of dollars, traveled thousands of miles, and getting on boats that are these professional traffickers. You don't start solving a problem by saying we're not going to do anything about it. If you stop the inflow and then made more arrangements for legal immigration and people truly are refugees, I think you'd have a better situation. Now, guess what? That's my opinion. I'm a priest. People can disagree with me. People can disagree with bishops, even the Pope, on secular matters like this. But the basic principle has to be Christianity and its Western civilization needs to be defended because that's how we're here. I'm of Irish descent. If the Christians hadn't, taken over in Ireland through evangelization, who knows what I'd be. So I'm very grateful for the Christian heritage. I think we have to defend it.
Robert Royal, were you stunned that the Pope called scafari again, given the problems?
No, because I can see him looking at the G20 and thinking, I need to say something. And again, we don't know whether scalfari is actually how it's pronounced. Scalfari is. There's a portion of the conversation that they have where they're talking about Pascal and Leibniz, and it's just crazy, confused. So maybe the other parts of it are confused too. But I know Marcello Pera. I know him rather well.
Was the Benedict collaborator?
He used to be the president of the Italian Senate, and he's a very interesting man. He's not a believer, but he's very sympathetic toward what Benedict and John Paul were trying to do in defending the West. He even goes to the point where he says that the Pope hates the West. Now, I consider that to be an extreme way to look at it, but it's interesting that someone outside who's not a believer and just trying to assess what do all these moves add up to thinks of them as somehow contributing to the threat, not solving the problem. And particularly on this immigration and refugee thing, all countries have immigrants coming all the time, but they have regulations about how immigrants are going to come into their countries. There's a kind of a mixture of what I would regard as a Christian idealism about helping people who are marginalized and poor, and there are many ways that can be done. And that, however, kind of gets elided into we're going to accept every people into our societies. We see that in terms of popularity in America, in Europe, and even elsewhere in places in the world, that is not a very likely scenario. The Pope is trying to get us to be more welcoming. But in fact, when people feel that their cultures, their nations are under threat, they're much less likely to be generous in the way that he's talking about. They're going to be very strict about immigration laws, and that's what we're seeing even here in America.
All over the world. Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, thank you for being here. And you can follow Robert Royal and Father Jerry's commentary at CatholicThing.org.